Okay, let's take it away, Mayor Hansen.
All right, great. Well, greetings, everyone. I'm Ferndale Mayor Greg Hansen, and I'm honored to be asked to launch this event. I was introduced to Christine Grant by a colleague a few months ago, and in speaking with her, I was immediately impressed by her knowledge and engaged by her thoughts about the internet as an essential utility for our communities. In addition to my duties as mayor, I'm also an instructor at Whatcom Community College, where I teach hospitality and tourism business management. And I know firsthand what many families are experiencing right now while working from home. Just today, my daughter, my wife, and I were all working from home or going to school. And we all three were trying to stream meetings this morning. And yes, I could certainly feel the strain on my broadband internet. Current conditions really highlight the importance of this utility going forward. But current conditions also have shown where there are some serious inequities in how this now essentially, serious inequities in the access to this now essential utility. The City of Ferndale's comprehensive plan quotes, the need for quick and reliable access to information continues to expand, and there is little doubt that high-speed internet access has become an essential utility. Our comprehensive plan, though, also notes that the degree to which the City of Ferndale will become responsible for providing this utility is yet to be determined. This is where the PUD can really take the lead, providing this essential utility to small cities like Ferndale and the rest of Whatcom County. So, first, I'd like to introduce Christine Grant. Christine Grant is a candidate for the Whatcom County Public Utility District Commission, District 1. She teaches energy policy at Western Washington University's Institute for Energy Studies and has over a decade of experience working in public and private utilities across the country. She has worked as a consultant for the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, Inland Power and Light, Seattle City Light, Columbia River PUD, the Environment and Energy Study Institute, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, the American Farmland Trust, the Port of Seattle, the Washington State Department of Health, and dozens of other utilities, agencies, and municipalities. As commissioner, she will work to increase access to broadband internet services, create clean energy jobs, and conserve water resources. She has a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and from Wellesley College, and has served on the board of Spark Northwest and Washington Conservation Voters. She is a mom, and 3 generations of her family have called Whatcom County home. Her guest tonight is Christopher Mitchell. Christopher Mitchell is the director of the Community Broadband Networks Initiative with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Christopher's work focuses on telecommunications, helping communities ensure the networks upon which they depend are accountable to the community. He is a leading national expert on community broadband networks and speaks at conferences across the United States on the subject, occasionally to directly debate opponents of public ownership. He was honored as one of 2012's top 25 in the public sector technology by Government Technology, which honors the top doers, drivers, and dreamers in the nation each year. That same year, the National Association of Telecommunications Officers and Advisors named ILSR the Broadband Organization of the Year. And in 2011, that organization also honored Mitchell for his policy work. On a day-to-day basis, Mitchell runs muninetworks.org, the comprehensive online clearinghouse of information about community broadband. In April 2012, he published 3 in-depth case studies of city publicly owned gigabit networks called Broadband at the Speed of Light. And in 2011, Mitchell released the Community Broadband Map, a comprehensive map of community-owned networks. He earned a master's degree in public policy from the Hubert Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota, and a bachelor's degree in political science from Macalester College. So, Christine Grant and Christopher Mitchell, it's all yours.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mayor Hansen, for that introduction, for your support, and for your leadership. Chris, welcome from St. Paul, Minnesota. You know, someone with your expertise is, I'm sure, highly sought after right now. So I really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us tonight. And, you know, when we spoke a few weeks ago about this event, it was really interesting to learn that you also have an energy policy background, because in many ways, there's so many parallels between what happened with electrification 100 years ago and the challenges we're facing now with broadband infrastructure. And so much of the challenge has to do with policy and finance, rather than technology. The technology is here, it exists. But let's start with the technology, and make sure that we all kind of know what we're talking about. So when I first started thinking about running for this position last year, I knew that PUDs had the authority to provide telecommunication services. Our PUD wasn't providing any services, but many people suggested that I read Susan Crawford's book, Fiber, which is kind of the book that I think a lot of people read and then they get really excited about fiber. I was just blown away by how impressive fiber is as a technology, and was also just really scared about how behind the US is compared to other countries. And one of my favorite chapters in that book is why US internet access is awful. So can you just paint a picture for the audience of why, despite the fact that so many people, pretty much everyone in America has contact with the internet in some way, just why our quality of service is so bad right now? Let's start there.
Yes, I'd like to start by trashing this country that I love. Let me actually start by also thanking Mayor Hansen, Councilmember Stone, Christine. I really just want to take a moment to celebrate people who make local government work, people who are trying to improve it. I think that's tremendously important. And in a time when I think too many people are focused on the national picture, when we can really make a difference at the local level, I just really want to appreciate your work to do that. So at the national level, our broadband is definitely not as good as it could be, on average, and that's true whether you're in a city, it's true whether you're in a rural area, and we have a tremendous variability across that. We see that some rural areas have very high quality access. I mean, if you go out to Chelan and Grant counties, if you head into North Dakota, almost anywhere, you'll find better access than you can get in Seattle for the most part. Now, on the other hand, you can go probably 50 miles away from most of those areas and have no access. So we desperately need to do something about that. We've seen a real failure of federal leadership. This is where other countries have done better. They've enacted national policies that have led to higher quality service to everyone, more reasonable rates, higher rates of reliability, things like that. So, across the United States, I think we can broadly say that we are failing both at making sure everyone in rural areas has access, and we are failing to make sure that people in urban areas, for whom, if they have enough money, they could get access to a cable network, but they are not able to access it because there's not an affordable option. And that's generally the two main failures is kind of one of lack of access or an inability to access something that is there. And local policies can really improve upon that. It is something that we can really make a difference at locally.
Mm-hmm. So, can we talk a little bit about, so the official FCC definition of high-speed internet is 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. And for people that are working in this space, increasingly that definition just feels woefully out of touch with what people need, like the example Mayor Hansen was providing of his whole family being at home, all trying to do video calls at the same time. We know that the need for broadband keeps growing. There's sort of different estimates about just how much our need for broadband is increasing with each year. But looking forward, it seems like we're going to want speeds of, much higher than 25 megabits per second. So, what do you think of this FCC definition? And then can you talk a little bit about why fiber is such an important part of our future infrastructure?
Yes. I think if we had designed the minimum definition for broadband a year ago, it would merit revisiting today because so much has changed as of 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the definition for broadband that the federal government uses was actually based on data that was put into researched and analyzed 6 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it actually, in 2014, there was a process to try to figure out what should be the minimum definition of broadband. And to give you a sense of what goes into that, it's not what an individual computer needs. It's not what you, Chris, need. It's what your whole family needs in order to not just abstractly, but what are the most common applications that people use? And if you abstract that to a household trying to do that in the normal course of life, what kind of a connection do they need? And they came to the conclusion 6 years ago that it was 25.3. That was before Ring doorbells were popular. It was before anyone was really doing video chatting in a serious way, with the rise of Apple and Google products to make it easier. And now Zoom, which a year ago almost no one knew about, it seems like, aside from a few of us techie type folks. So yeah, it's not surprising. I mean, I think traffic demand increases and doubles roughly every 18 months to 2 years, and yet that definition has stayed the same. It's woefully inadequate. That said, there's actually tens of millions of people for whom 25.3 would be an improvement. I mean, to give you a sense, though, the typical broadband speed you would get on a basic cable package, if you're paying a normal amount in a city for a cable package, you're probably getting on the order of 100 to 200 megabits per second or more down, and you are probably getting on the order of 5 to 10 up. And that is enough to probably run a household today. When you have, let's say, 2 or 3 kids, everyone's doing Zoom at the same time, and perhaps at other times you have video games, you have other things that are important to quality of life today. So, the definition is about 10% too slow for today. And then on top of that, how that definition gets used is that we give out federal dollars and sometimes state dollars to companies who will build to that minimum speed. And so we're actually wastefully using taxpayer dollars because we're building networks that are obsolete already, which is very frustrating. And I try not to dwell too much on it because I'm afraid people will lose faith in government. But the answer is that in some ways, we really need to focus on high quality technologies that will move forward. The speed 25.3 is weird at 25.3 in part because they're trying to just shoehorn in DSL, a technology that is obsolete. In fact, 8 years ago, AT&T's CEO was saying it's obsolete. So it's not anything that anyone disagrees on. It's obsolete. The future is fiber. The future is also, to some extent, high-speed wireless in some areas. Not because fiber is not something we should get there eventually. I fundamentally believe that as a policy over the next 10 to 20 years, it would make sense both economically and for equity reasons to try to get fiber to everyone. But it will take so long to get fiber to some people. We should start with high-speed wireless there, where we can in more rural areas. But for cities, we need to focus on fiber. That's what's going to make us competitive. Fiber is almost limitless in its capacity. New technologies allow for all kinds of innovation. And when cities do fiber, or when public entities more broadly do fiber, it lends itself to all kinds of opportunities around smart city stuff. And one of the reasons for that is that on fiber, moving bits is basically free. There's a very low operating cost. And so you really free yourself up to do a lot of interesting things. And one that I'm always interested in is air pollution while monitoring. I think it's somewhat depressing right now to think about how poor the air quality is, but it would be good to have a sense of that, to try to track that in some ways. And just different kinds of sensors you can have everywhere on a fiber network. It doesn't really cost you anything once you have the fiber out there.
So just to make sure, I teach part-time at the university, and one of my philosophies is there are no bad questions. And just from looking at some of the attendees on here, I know that when I first started learning about this and people were talking about you know, up and down speeds. I didn't know what that was exactly. And, you know, symmetrical and asymmetrical. Can you just touch on that so that we know, so that people understand why those upload and download speeds are important?
Sure, and now begins my 10-minute history of how technology
Well,
has
maybe
evolved.
don't
No,
go
I know, I'm just kidding. No, so I mean, effectively, in the beginning, when many of us were using dial-up modems, it was more or less synchronous. You would send information to the internet as rapidly as you would download it. And then as the internet went from just being text to being images and multimedia and ultimately video, one of the things smart engineers did was they figured most people are going to be doing more downloading than uploading. So they prioritized that to squeeze more speed out of it. Those decisions then kind of got baked into a lot of the gear that was created. And so most of the cable and telephone companies today offer products that are much faster for you to download than upload. Which is to say, if you want to stream 20 Netflix streams, you can do that. But if you wanted to send that equivalent of data to share videos with your relatives, you really can't do that. And that's really important today when many of us are not allowed to really leave our homes to work. And so my wife and I are both working from home. I may be sending large files, doing video chats, and still doing other things at the same time. For instance, I maybe have a hard drive that's backing up or something like that. There's a lot of things that we're not doing today because we cannot upload as fast as we can download. But on fiber networks and also on many of the wireless networks that are advanced, you can upload and download at really fast speeds. So people talk about being symmetrical, and that just generally means, it doesn't really mean that we absolutely need the exact same up and down speeds, but it means that the network should not be slowing us down in one direction. The other piece of it is just that I think it's worth noting that for those of us that care about this sort of a thing, uploading is the ability to produce. It's the ability to contribute to the internet. And there's an argument that I think has some merit that the big cable companies, they want us to be consumers. They want us to buy content and to sit on our couches all day. And that's not how the internet should work. The internet is an amazing tool, possibly the most amazing human invention. And we should all be participating in it, not just consuming it.
Yeah, yes. My daughter and I made a great video this morning that we'll be sharing for everyone shortly. And we need good upload speeds to do that. And just before we move on to with fiber, again, you know, luckily I have some great friends that don't care at all about politics or any of this stuff, but sometimes they look at my campaign materials and they're like, Christine, why are you talking about nutrition? What is fiber? You know, and so, you know, just again to make sure we're all on the same page, and I could probably do better with this in my campaign materials is, you know, what fiber actually is, and I think Susan Crawford's book described it so well. Is actually, you know, there's little tiny strands of glass in the cable, and that allows the data to move at the speed of light. And so, you know, that's just something that I didn't understand previously to reading that book. And so it's great that there's people like you and Susan out there that are sort of making this kind of technology more accessible to more people. So anything else to add to that?
Well, I think it actually gets to an interesting question, which is, I feel like it's rare that I've been to a hearing with elected officials that were very, I would say, indoctrinated to the cable line of arguments. And they would often say, look at this, I got this phone. This phone is changing every year. Why would we invest in something with an assumption it would last forever? And the thing is that, you know, these fibers are like, you know, smaller than the width of a human hair now, perhaps. I was looking at a bundle that was about like that, and I have normal sized hands, and it had 3,456 fibers in it, I think. I'm trying to remember. It's one of the most dense new cables. And I was watching as a crew in South Minneapolis was installing it and trying to get a sense of the different policies that are required and how they break that out to run to individual homes for this local provider and things like that. And the thing is just that is a means of sending information. You use these lasers across it, and it costs a lot of money to put in, because you need to tear up the streets to get those underground often, unless you
Mhm.
have a dig once policy or other mechanisms. But fundamentally, you have to get it into place. That's where more than half of the cost is. And
Mhm.
then you can actually upgrade the endpoints. And if you just think about it conceptually as like a big tube,
Mhm.
and you can pump whatever you want through there, and you just change the pumps, and you have that tube in it forever. So this is
Mhm.
it's a device that it's a technology that really will be with us forever.
Mhm.
I was talking to folks who put in their first strand of fiber in 1984. They used
Wow.
it for 1 bit. You'll appreciate this, I'm sure, from an energy perspective. It's an energy utility. Their biggest
Mhm.
customer was a a cement manufacturer, or whatever that.
Mhm.
I don't know exactly what the term is, but they just wanted to know whether or not they were using certain pieces of equipment. And so it was 1 bit off or on. And they're now running more than a gigabit of data over that fiber installed in 1984.
Oh,
So,
wow.
so I mean, like this really is long, and there's nothing on the horizon. If there was something that would be better than fiber in the laboratories today, it would still take about 15 to 20 years to commercialize it and make it common. This stuff
Mhm.
doesn't move that fast. We used copper
Mhm.
for 100 years. We'll probably end up using fiber for 100 years or more. Wireless will continue to get better, but it's a limited quantity of it. So yeah,
Mhm.
fiber is as amazing as you say and better.
Okay. And when you hear about a future-proof technology, that is infrastructure that makes that is good to for elected officials to invest in. So, you never want to invest in something that's going to become obsolete soon, but as I've learned more about fiber, I've become more and more convinced that this is infrastructure that we need, and that we're getting behind, in fact, by not having it. And so that's kind of a good transition to just some examples that you might be able to provide. You've worked all across the country, as you were saying before we all started the Zoom. You're flying all over the country before COVID, helping communities. And so, can you talk a little bit about some of the success stories, sort of some of your favorite success stories, and particularly how fiber has helped reinvigorate economies? Especially, I know you've worked in a lot of rural areas, and how can fiber help with economic development and job creation? So tell us your success stories.
My favorite success story is probably one that was also profiled by Susan Crawford in her book Fiber. I've long been a strong fan of what Wilson, North Carolina has done.
Yeah.
Wilson, North Carolina is east of the Triangle. It's a part of the country that has a history of manufacturing and tobacco growing and ag producer type stuff. And in the 90s and 2000s, it was not a good time to have your economy dependent on that. They were the tobacco center of the world. And as the producer, as manufacturing moved to China or to Mexico, a lot of their jobs were lost. And they ended up building a fiber optic network to connect everyone. Um, they ended up having a big fight about it. There's a lot of different things to talk about in Wilson, but the thing that I love about Wilson is that it really has reinvigorated the town. It's brought a lot of new jobs to town. It's given people more of a pride, and for people who still are struggling, I mean, families can face a lot of dislocation when you see that kind of switch from an ag economy to one that's more focused on higher tech stuff. They have been among the most aggressive of cities to make sure that everyone's benefiting from their community. It's really big things like making sure that everyone in public housing can have $10 a month service,
And that's
which may
gigabit service?
in that case, it's actually 50 megabit, I believe,
Okay.
symmetrical.
Okay.
And in other cases, in San Francisco, there's a public-private partnership that will provide gigabit service to public housing families for about $10 a month.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so these sorts of policies to make sure that people are connected are just so important. And one of the things that was in Susan's book actually is Tiffany Cooper, a woman who is in public housing trying to get a nursing degree. Her children, she would have to figure out transportation to get them to the libraries for school. And when they got that access, it allowed her to complete her education more rapidly. It just led to benefits for her whole family. I mean, these things are really important.
Mhm.
Families really are hurting right now, especially. They may be unable to afford a pricey connection. Um, and so when I look at what Wilson has done, and they've pioneered a number of other approaches that have also helped, even families that have good money, that have good jobs, but don't have good credit, they may struggle to
Mhm.
get connected today. And Wilson's pioneered programs to deal with that. So anyway, I could talk about Wilson all day, but I don't want to
Mhm.
spend the whole rest of the time on this question. But let me
Well,
tell you, Chattanooga blew my socks off
yeah.
just recently because they have committed to every child in the school in the free and reduced lunch program, which is a majority of students, about 17,000 families with more than 30,000 kids, are getting free 100 gigabit service. And the schools are able to provide that for the next 10 years, making sure that kids are connected well in the home. And
Mhm.
those are the kind of decisions you can make. And they raised some of the money, local governments appropriated some of the money, they found a way to make it happen, and they had the
Mhm.
power to do that because they owned the network, and
Mhm.
they had a sense of, they had developed expertise, and they could make these sorts of decisions.
Yeah, that was I read about that a few weeks ago and, felt like, wow, that's the kind of community that was really they were really prepared for something like this. And I mean, Chattanooga gets a lot of praise for a lot of things. They seem to be doing many things right. So yeah, that we all need to figure out what they're doing there in Chattanooga. But back to some of the economic development things, your the website that you maintain, Muni Networks. I love the economic development section that you have there, and
Hmm.
just some of the case studies. And you might need to help me remember where it was exactly, but there was a case study. I think it was either Idaho or Wyoming where they got fiber to a community, and then they were able to set up a program with a community in South Korea
That's right, in
to
Powell, Wyoming.
okay, and it created a lot of good part-time jobs for people to teach English as a second language, but it was only possible because they had that really great fiber connection, which you need when you're teaching another language. It's hard enough to learn a new language. You can't have that delay. You need to be able to make eye contact, really hear people enunciate. But I loved hearing that story just because, I'm at a phase in my life where a lot of my friends are parents that have been home with young kids and would love a part-time job to bring in a few $100 a month extra. And those are the kinds of opportunities that you get when you start putting in this infrastructure. So I loved that case study.
Yes. One of the things that we see is that some jobs are available to anyone that has a high quality internet connection.
Hmm.
Especially where you might be answering phone calls and things like that. They've called it insourcing, I think, where rather than having a big warehouse of people in some part of South Carolina or the Philippines, they will distribute the materials, and people across South Dakota will be answering phone calls for a certain business, and they monitor your internet connection. And if you have a connection that is not fast enough or is not reliable enough over time, you will not have that job. And so that's one way in which there's some individual opportunities. But a lot of these companies, they are looking out for that. And some of the application materials will ask you, what is your internet connection like?
Yeah.
And now similarly, if you want to try to attract a business, multiple jobs to an area, like Mount Vernon did this with several
Hmm.
different firms have moved to Mount Vernon out of Seattle or other areas
Hmm.
because of the high quality of connectivity. And I
Hmm.
don't, and I don't want to. I think it's important that people have a sense that if Bellingham was to move forward with this, if Whatcom County moved forward with this,
Hmm.
it needs to be coupled with other economic development.
Hmm.
Know-how. You have to know how to sell it. It's not just the case that in 2021 or 2022 that having a fiber network is enough. There's additional work that needs to be done. But what
Hmm.
we increasingly hear from employers is that if you don't have a fiber network, you're not even on the list. You don't get a
Hmm.
chance to compete for it in
Yeah.
in that case. And then on top of that, if you have a good private provider or two, there's a question now about diversified fiber paths, because we're certainly seeing a lot of really scary weather events, and businesses want to know that if a disaster happens on the east part of their building, will the west part still be able to be connected? And so they want to have different paths for the fiber, which again is something that if you won't control that, it's up to you if it's worth that investment to make sure if you're going to put in a new fiber path for this factory or something like that, you can weigh that investment. The decision is yours. It's not a company that might be headquartered on the East Coast, whether or not you're competitive for that job.
Well, and so before we move on, I think just it would be interesting too to hear a little bit more from you, but before we really kind of dig into Whatcom County and my plans and what we could do here. But I think it's always interesting to think about what's happening in other countries. And again, Susan Crawford, visited all kinds of countries when she was researching her book, South Korea, Singapore, Sweden, Portugal, lots of countries are much further along. Can you just paint a little bit of a picture, about sort of where we stand compared to other developed countries in terms of not only our quality of service, but our cost of service?
Yes. Susan has this phrase that I love, which is that when people from South Korea or maybe Stockholm, Sweden, or places where it's the best for internet access come here, they feel like they're going back in time on a kind of relaxing vacation in a way that I might go camping or something like that to give up, a little bit of technical, normalcy, because our connectivity is not very good. And at the same time, I think it's worth not overstating it. There's no place it's perfect. And so we could certainly become number one again with the right policies. There's a lot of places in Europe where they haven't connected people in very rural areas also. But at the same time, if you go to places like Stockholm, for instance, which is one of the better places, they have made this a decision more than 20 years ago that the city would actually run fiber throughout the entire city. And in that case, the city wasn't going to operate it. The city was just going to lease it. And so companies could then compete across it. And that was their approach. And they had some of the best 4G early on. I haven't checked, but I'd be shocked if they don't have really great 5G. It's one of the reasons Sweden's been a technical leader is because of this connectivity. And in fact, all across Sweden, you have fiber networks and a lot of high quality connectivity that you don't see necessarily in other countries, even in Scandinavia. Now, if you go to like South Korea, Japan, in part because of national government policy and subsidies that they've thought are worth it, they have very high quality connectivity, and they're testing out some of the technologies of the future. I always struggle. I always wonder if people will find this incredible, which is to say not credible. Because you think, well, we've invented everything now, right? I mean, you always think you've invented everything, but there are innovations yet to come in a lot of ways, and it worries me if they're not happening in the United States. And so I'm very excited at some of the places where we have really great labs, we have really great connectivity. I think Chattanooga is attracting people to try to do interesting things. Ammon, Idaho is attracting people to do some interesting things. And so I mean, I don't like to dwell too much on other countries. But the simple fact is that we created the internet, and we still tend to be among the most innovative. We have the most innovative businesses in many ways, but our infrastructure is not allowing us to ensure we will have that lead in 10 and 20 years.
Okay. Well, let's transition a little bit to the situation here in Whatcom County. And so one of the first things I'd like to talk about is sort of this differentiation between fiber backbones, middle miles, and then getting, fiber to homes and businesses, also known as fiber to the premises. And And so, just a little background, and I saw in the chat, someone was asking about this, how's the PUD going to collaborate with the Port of Bellingham? And so just some background is that PUDs have had authority to provide telecommunication services, wholesale telecommunication services, so open access fiber networks, since the year 2000. The ports around the state got that access, that same authority, in 2016. And there's a little bit of a history with the PUD, sort of failed attempt at a fiber project with the PUD back in the early 2000s, kind of a build it and they will come approach, and we will circle back to that because we're going to talk about how we learn from our mistakes. But so what the port is looking at right now is building backbones. So they don't have a ton of funding, but they have broken this backbone up into a few different segments, and they're looking at funding the first one. And so, I'm all for backbones, but, what I've learned through many conversations with different folks like you that focus on this is that when we really start getting the most value out of this infrastructure investment, it's when we start getting it to homes and businesses. And so can you talk just a little bit about that, and then also the role of, connecting wireless to fiber?
Yes. In many ways, I think it helps to think of this like transportation. If someone asks you, did it cost more to build the interstates across the nation, or did it cost more to build every city street in the nation, in aggregate? Of course, it would cost far more to build all the city streets. There's just, orders of magnitude more mileage in that than there are in the backbones. The backbones are still important. But it's similar principles where you need, big, thick backbones carrying a lot of traffic simultaneously, on main arterial routes. And then you have what we may call middle mile to try and get it out closer to the edge. And then what we call the edge in computing, the home in this case, is where you might hear the term last mile or first mile, but that's where you're actually connecting the homes. And there's some debate still about how to get this mix right and what role policy should play in it. But when I look at it, we've had several experiments. In fact, Alberta built a supernet 20 years ago in Canada, and they built this massive middle mile and backbone network. And the only thing it really did was enable cherry picking. I shouldn't say the only thing. It did a lot of good, but it did not lead to a lot of last mile investment to bring all the homes and businesses online. Massachusetts went through the same thing about 10 years ago. And that's because the economics of building to the home are intimidating. This is why the private sector underinvests in connecting to the home. If there's no connection there yet, it's expensive to build it. And if there is a connection there, the way the economics work, whoever maintains that connection might be charging a lot of money today. But if you try to put in a rival connection, they can cut that price back and cut it in half and try to make sure that no residents or businesses want to take the new network. And this is why we don't have a lot of competition for broadband. It's not a new phenomenon. We saw it with cable networks in the 80s and 90s. We're seeing it with fiber networks now. And so this is why cities and public utility districts, counties have to get involved to try to break this stalemate to bring more investment.
Right.
Now, the cost of building the last mile is definitely the most expensive, but that's where you actually connect people. Now that said, if you want to have a really good wireless network, people often think of wireless as being magic, and I'll be honest, it kind of is at a certain point. Like, you can really understand the physics of it, but it's still pretty wild the way it works. But it's often a wireless signal will be for a tenth of a mile or a mile, but then like my connection on my mobile phone will then run on a wire for the whole rest of the way. Because if you see the macro cells by the side of the highway, the 3 antennas, usually 3 vertical bars, it's your big telephone macro or your big wireless mobile macro cell. those are all connected with fiber. They don't go wireless to each other for the most part. And similarly with 5G, we're actually then moving those wireless antennas closer to you. So they might be within 500 feet of you or so. And then the whole rest of the journey is on a wire. And so basically, the more fiber you have, the better wireless you'll have. And often when you're in a rural area that doesn't have good wireless coverage, it's in part because of the cost of getting a good fiber connection there. Now, I think we're going to talk about Starlink. Some of this stuff does change that a little bit. It'll work. There's certain interesting implications for how we can do what we will now call terrestrial wireless versus satellite wireless. But for the most part, if you want a good wireless, you really need a good wireline network to pull the information off of the wires, off of the wireless. And that's just briefly, it's because wireless gets congested. You start interfering with each other, and so the less wireless you can use, the better your experience will be.
Yeah. I think, not to sound like too much of a Susan Crawford fangirl, but, I thought one of her analogies in the book was good about how, you can't just have wireless as a solution. That would be like having a bunch of airplanes without airports. You need those wires for the wireless to connect to. And then, just in terms of getting fiber to homes and businesses. So the port is beginning this investment in backbones. And what I think is really exciting about the role that the PUD could play is to continue to right now the port is the one that's paying for a lot of those backbones, mostly because they've been able to successfully apply for grants. And there's likely to be more funding for that, both at the federal and the state level, which I would really like to see the PUD getting a lot more aggressive about applying for those grants. They haven't been involved in this space since the early 2000s. But the other thing that's great, and it again connects to my energy background, is often with energy, there's high upfront costs for technologies that we want to put on our homes or our businesses, but they make sense over time. And so we need to find a way to finance them. And we need to do the same thing with getting fiber to the home. And there's several examples here in Washington State of other public utility districts that have come up with really nice financing models to help people not have to take on that kind of large capital expense of running the fiber to their home, getting it from the middle mile to their home. So one of the models is called a local utility district, where you and your neighbors all sort of get together, decide you want fiber, and then you amortize the cost of that capital investment over the course of 20 or 30 years. And so you'd get a bill, but it would be a very manageable monthly bill. And in the case of Washington State, because we do something called open access fiber networks, the PUD doesn't provide the retail service. It's you work through an internet service provider. So it's like you were talking about, Chris, where you can still foster competition among the private internet service providers while benefiting from public investments in the infrastructure that the private partners might not want to make. So, I think it's a nice balance that we have right now in Washington State. There's also, Mason County has done something called fiber hoods, which is kind of similar to what Kitsap County calls the local utility districts. And, there's also some banks, sort of mission-driven lenders and patient capital providers that are also looking at making some of these investments, because it is an investment that pays for itself over time, because the internet service providers are leasing the open access fiber. And so that's something where there's societal benefits from a public agency like a PUD building it and then leasing it, because we've got a whole bunch of fiber on Highway 9 here in Whatcom County, but it's owned by AT&T, and they're just using it as kind of a long haul backbone. So they're not making it accessible to anyone else. If a public sector entity owns it, we can kind of we can lease it and spread the love, so to speak. So, you know, that's a little bit technical, but that's where I believe the PUD needs to go. We need to work in partnership with the port, and maybe have them really focus on the backbones, but understand that the future involves getting fiber to the home, and there's a lot of work to do. So
No,
I
but
think we
you
can,
hit on
yeah.
you hit on so many key things there that are just I think people will should mull over. I mean, the first one is that this idea of like the amortization and the energy. It's exactly right. I mean, I think having an energy background is really helpful to understanding this. I mean, over the next 30 years, there probably is no cheaper technology over that 30 years than fiber.
Yeah.
Now, wireless looks cheaper over the next 5 years. But the question is, can we get the financing right to actually get the numbers right away? But then on top of that, I don't think people appreciate how affordable it is in that time frame, because I was having this discussion with some folks, and I was like, you know, if people understood that, like, what's standing between them and basically, let's say, $30 a month gigabit service from competitive providers that they can pick from if they get frustrated with their existing one, is like a $20 a month property tax potentially, or $20 a month, you know, assessment on the home, for a total cost of $50 a month for people to have these options. It's but you're right, it takes getting the financing right over time. So so much of this is we get mired in these discussions about, oh, we're comparing a 5-year wireless plan against a 20-year fiber plan. How do we do this? And when it comes down to it, we need to focus on the fiber and get it out to people.
Okay, well, let's transition to, you know, because another question I've received from a few people, and I know that a participant asked about this too, is Elon Musk going to save us, Chris? Do we even need to do anything, or will Starlink just solve all of our internet problems and just beam perfect internet from the sky to our homes?
It's, you know, you set it up really, really well, and I feel like I should defend Elon Musk in that it really is quite remarkable what low Earth orbits. Yes, yes. I mean, if you want to travel millions of miles in order to live on a poisonous planet, you know, Elon's your guy. Starlink is very interesting. The ability to have these low latencies, these faster speeds. We don't really know how fast yet. The initial speed tests are not very impressive from a perspective of what we're expecting. I think the cost may be a little more. But here's the thing that people need to keep in mind is that if Starlink is as great as Elon says it will be, everyone in Bellingham cannot sign up. 50% of Bellingham cannot sign up. 50% of Whatcom County cannot sign up. These satellites have limited capacity. And so in some ways, although I think it's really great, and if I ever spend a lot of time up on Denali, I think it takes like 3 months or 3 weeks minimum to summit
or sailing across the world.
Right, like that's going to be great. If I want to be a stockbroker in northern Michigan with great ping times, you know, it may be good. But from the perspective of connecting everyone in Whatcom County, it's actually going to be harmful, because if 10% of the people, and I don't even know if 10% will ultimately end up signing up for it, if 10% of Whatcom County takes that in the more rural areas, we still have to figure out how to connect the other 90%. And it's now going to be more costly because we've lost 10% of the market.
Right.
And so, you know, there's no sense in which the current constellations are going to be able to cover everyone in rural areas, which means we still need a provider of last resort. If anything, it might make our job harder to make sure everyone has high quality connectivity.
And it's easy then for people to say, oh, but we've solved the rural connectivity problem. And yeah, from what I've read too, the initial test results are not, speed results are not great. As more people sign up, it's going to get worse, and it sounds expensive. So that's not good from the perspective, from the equity lens, which we're all really focused on. So So
Not
yeah,
for not for individuals. I mean, in some ways, I will say this: if there's a small population in the eastern part of the county in which it's really expensive to figure out how to get them connected very soon, it's possible that you could actually beam down a connection and then split it up using local wireless or even local fiber and distribute that one signal to an entire community or two if this terms of service allow that sort of a thing. So there's some cases
hmm
in which we can be creative about it, but there's going to be a ton of news stories over the next 6 months about how great it is and it's solving our problems. But most of those reporters don't understand there's a limited number of people who can sign up in a geographic area.
hmm hmm Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of challenges, but it's a question that comes up a lot, because it's getting a lot of media attention and probably will continue to get a lot of media attention. So I wanted to come back to you know failed attempts. So I think we, as I said, in Whatcom County, shortly after PUDs got the authority to provide service, there was an attempt here that didn't work. They to kind of make a very long story short, it took kind of a build it and they will come approach, didn't work. A lot of stranded assets they sold to the city of Bellingham. So the city of Bellingham has used some of that fiber for their own municipal operations. But I think what happened then is that I think the PUD said, "Oof, that didn't go well," and then they haven't touched it for 15 years, really until the port has kind of started moving them along a little bit, and then boom, the pandemic hit. I'm running for office now, stirring up all this conversation. So there's clearly now some momentum, and so the first thing I want to say is I have no problem with failure. We all make mistakes, and I think what's important is that we learn from our mistakes and we don't try to cover them up. And one of the things I've been listening to some of your podcasts, and you were talking about how important you think it is to sort of start small and try different approaches. And that's one of my mantras is dream big, start small. And so can you,
There's a Michael Franti song on his new album about that.
oh,
If
well,
you're not familiar, look it up.
it's a good approach. So can you just tell me a little bit about maybe how that's worked operationally with some of the communities that you've worked? I certainly have a few ideas for how we might dream big and start small with fiber here. But what does that look like? How do we learn without making sort of catastrophic mistakes?
Yes, well, I think the first thing that I want to say is actually something I wanted to say earlier, and this comes back to it, which is that I think it's really important not to wait too long. And
Mm,
one of the things we've seen is that, for instance, Open Cape in the Cape Cod area, which
mm,
has more poverty than a lot of people realize on Cape Cod, it's a more challenging economic environment to build in. But they've been trying to figure out how to get into last mile connections because they've mostly done middle mile anchor institutions, schools, libraries, stuff like that. The CARES Act comes along and they're able to take advantage of that money because they have a plan, because they're already starting small. And so the first thing to note is that starting small can give you the opportunity to be nimble when money comes along, when money needs to be spent to get Wi-Fi connectivity up in a bunch of parking lots at the minimum for CARES Act, that sort
mm,
of a thing. If the Democrats win, we were expecting to see major investment in new broadband programs. Having 6 months of experience will put you much to the front of the line
oh,
compared to people who are
mhm.
just thinking, we've been thinking about it for a little bit.
Yeah.
So starting small is great. And one of the things I would do is look at areas in which the fiber is near a corridor that may be a good target place, in order to test out if there's a lot of homeowners that are interested, if you have a sense of where the demand is, or if you have a sense that there's a group of people that cannot access the internet, particularly kids in school, and you want to target that area with a limited public expenditure to say,
hmm
all right, here's our goal. We're going to connect 50 families that otherwise would
hmm
not be connected, and we're going to build out the fiber in this way to do that. Those are
hmm
the sorts of things to start looking at, particularly when you're considering the local improvement or local utility district. It gives you a lot of freedom to do that sort of a thing. But I also want to say one other thing, and that's that we're talking about something that's going to be a 20 or 30-year project. In the history of municipal infrastructure, we've seen airports that spent 20 years being a financial wreck that turned into being very important for local economic development. The Utopia network in Utah has been used as an example of why no city should get involved with broadband, because they made a lot of mistakes and they suffered a lot of attacks, frankly, from the state government, from big companies. They've persevered and they are expanding rapidly. They are paying their bills. And in another 10 years, I think it's possible that most of the people who are on the network will have no sense of its troubled history. So it's important to make sure we try to get these things right, to not be too intimidated, but also to like really, I mean, I'll praise local leaders, but they also have to have their feet held to the fire to make sure that we have a sense of what's happening with transparency so we can correct errors and things like that. So that's sort of how I think about that question.
Yeah. Well, we're coming to the end of our hour. I see there's a few more questions in the chat. I might just try to touch on two of them. One is about the districts in the PUD. Are they geographic? They are geographic, but it's really mainly just for election purposes. So as a future commissioner, I would make decisions that affect the entire county. So on November 3rd, every single person in Whatcom County will vote on this race. I didn't have a primary. If I'd had a primary, it only would have been for District 1 voters, which is basically the south part of Whatcom County. There was also a question about if the PUD does backbone, middle mile in Whatcom County, who will build the fiber to the premises? Well, so actually, I think with the backbone and middle mile, it might be the port building some of the backbone, and since they already have some funding to do that, and then with the fiber to the premises, that would be what Chris and I were talking about with some of those financing models, like local utility districts, where you amortize the cost over a very long period of time. And Mason County PUD, Mason County doesn't always get a whole lot of, praise for being innovative, but their PUD is just incredible. And they have really tried to figure out how to reduce costs for that last mile of fiber. And they have this really nerdy video with this. Maybe you've heard about this, Chris. It's called a vibratory plow, where they are able to just they don't have to put the fiber so deep into the ground. And so they will come and put the fiber in, through your front yard, and then, your grass will, it really isn't that invasive at all. Your grass will grow back, it looks like, in a few weeks or something, especially if during the rainy months here. So there's already a lot of innovation happening, trying to figure out how we not only finance that last mile, but how we make it as cheap as possible. And my goal is just that we get in the game. And Chris, I will certainly be staying in touch with you, because it's wonderful to talk to people that know more than you about these issues. So thank you so very much for joining us, and it's been wonderful to get to know you, and all the materials that you post online are just really, really wonderful. So so thank you for your work. It's really important. And now we're gonna, and now we're gonna welcome Bellingham City Council Member Hannah Stone to wrap up the hour. I know we're a little past the hour, but Hannah, welcome, and thank you again, Chris.
Yeah, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Chris, so much. I've learned a lot, and when you talk about financing the last mile, that's why I'm here, is to ask for support for Christine to get to November 3rd. And one of the things I think about right now is the fact that I'm not asking, for you to donate as much as asking you for an investment in the future of Whatcom County, and how important it is right now to make sure that we are electing leaders who are going to be asking hard questions and doing those deep dives and heavy lifts that are really needed to keep us moving forward. It's so critical. And right now, you could go to grant 4, it's the number 4, PUD.org, to make a contribution to the campaign. And I wanted to highlight the fact that Christine was recently endorsed by the Washington Education Association, and never before has WEA endorsed a PUD race. I think a lot of it speaks to the time that we're living in right now, thinking about the pandemic and the extreme need to address the digital divide. And this is something that Christine has cared about before the pandemic, and really her commitment to helping our community bridge that divide and ensure that everybody in our community has, you know, equal access to the infrastructure that they need to work, and for children to complete schooling, to access healthcare. I mean, all of that is so critical. And basically Christine and her family, now knowing and having experienced what campaigning is all about, and knowing the sacrifice and commitment that she and her family have made to our community, I feel like it's really our turn to step up and support them. It's the way that we contribute to our community moving forward. So again, I just want to thank everybody for attending today and encourage you to go to grant4pud.org. Whatever amount you're able to contribute, this is a group effort, and we're hoping to get to November 3rd together. So thank you so much for your support.
Well, thank you, Hannah.